Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are taking an analytical deep dive into a collection of really profound scholarly dialogues. It's called Rethinking Race, Class, Language, and Gender, and it's edited by Pierre W. Orlis.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. We're moving beyond what feels like a very simplified, sort of single-axis debate. The constant question, is the real problem race? Or is it all about economic class?
Exactly. We're trying to get past that.
And this book's fundamental proposition seems to be that these categories of identity, race, class, all of them, they aren't just separate forces of inequality that, occasionally bump into each other.
Precisely. That's the key. The core argument here, which Orlis and all these amazing contributors synthesize, is that race, class, gender, language, and even sexuality, they function as an interconnected matrix of oppressions.
A matrix.
It's matrix. They operate simultaneously, they're interlocking, and they work together to sustain these really deep structural power imbalances.
So we're talking about intersectionality, but it sounds like we're focused very, very specifically on the systemic mechanism.
Mechanisms, yes.
The gears that actually make this matrix function. Let's try to make that tangible for our listener.
Yeah.
How does that play out in the real world?
Okay, well, if you imagine someone trying to navigate a complex institution, let's say the healthcare system or the housing market, their ability to get what they need isn't just determined by one thing.
Right.
So take a working class Black woman who primarily speaks a non-prestige language, maybe Spanish. She doesn't just face classism on Monday and then racism on Tuesday and sexism on Wednesday.
It's not a checklist.
Not at all.
Yeah.
She faces a specific compounded form of marginalization where the negative effects of all those systems overlap and they actually intensify one another at the exact same moment.
That makes the reality of just trying to navigate the world so much clearer. And, why does this deep dive matter right now?
Well, because
Even as we talk about intersectionality, there is this constant gravitational pull, especially in mainstream discourse, to just simplify everything.
absolutely, we still hear claims of a post-racial society, the idea that racism is over, or you hear these really forceful arguments that class is the only thing that truly matters, and that makes race basically irrelevant.
And that simplification is, well, it's dangerous, isn't it? Because it provides this easy ideological cover for the very systems we need to be looking at.
It's the perfect cover. So this deep dive is absolutely necessary to, cut through that noise and reveal the systemic, interlocking complexity of it all. Our mission here is to understand how the system is wired to perpetuate itself.
And we really want to emphasize this is going to be a strictly systems-focused analysis. We're looking at the structural mechanisms, the incentives, the feedback loops that produce these unequal outcomes.
We are not engaging in partisan arguments or assigning individual blame.
Not at all. We're here to study the engine, not to judge the passengers.
Good way to put it.
So let's start with the intellectual origin story of this collection. The editor is Pierre W. Orlis. He's an assistant professor, and his research covers critical race theory, post-colonial studies, gender studies, a whole range.
A very wide range. And the book itself came out of a really unique process. It wasn't just him writing. It was 2 years of in-depth interviews and dialogues with this genuinely diverse group of, as he puts it, committed social justice educators and scholars.
What stands out to me immediately is his methodology. He explicitly used dialogue as a form of inquiry.
Yes. And that's such a powerful intellectual tradition. It's not new. It stretches all the way back to Socrates. It was famously used by Paulo Freire in critical pedagogy.
And you see people like Noam Chomsky, who's actually in this book, use it all the time.
All the time. The goal wasn't just to collect individual scholarly papers or, pull a few quotes. It was literally to co-construct knowledge by putting these diverse experts into conversation with each other.
And that intentional diversity is just so key, isn't it? I mean, he invited scholars from critical race theory, from Orthodox and neo-Marxism, multicultural education, sociology.
And he specifically sought out international voices, too.
Right.
He did. And this was a very deliberate attempt to build a truly comprehensive sort of hybrid view of oppression that couldn't just be dismissed as, a single field echo chamber.
It's harder to dismiss when you have so many different fields pointing to the same structure.
Exactly. When you bring Richard Delgado, who is a key figure in critical race theory, into a dialogue with someone like Zeus Leonardo, who's focused on that race-class synthesis, and then you add Noam Chomsky, focused on political economy, well, you get a pressure cooker of intellectual insight.
The publishing context is also just It's absolutely vital here. The book came out in 2011, which Peter McLaren notes in the foreword was a really portentous time.
Oh, absolutely. This was right after the collapse of free market fundamentalism. The 2008 financial crisis was still incredibly fresh in everyone's mind, and critically, right after the election of Barack Obama.
Okay, so let's talk about that timing. Why is it so essential?
Well, you have these two massive, seemingly contradictory events. The financial crisis laid bare the deep structural inequality that's just inherent in advanced capitalism. You couldn't ignore it.
It was right there for everyone to see.
But then the election of the first black president immediately triggered this powerful ideological countermovement.
The rise of colorblind and post-racial discourse.
Yes. The media narrative suddenly became, racism is over. Look, we elected Obama. Problem solved.
And what was the function of that narrative? What did it do?
The function, according to the scholars in this book, was containment. It acted as an ideological shield. It claimed victory and, in doing so, effectively shut down any further critical discussion about all the racial inequality that was still so persistent.
So it was a way of saying, move on, nothing to see here.
Pretty much. Mike Laren described this narrative as unleashing a really powerful white backlash against people of color, specifically by reframing any racial critiques as being, unnecessary or divisive in a world where the problem was supposedly solved. This book was a direct scholarly intervention against that exact kind of simplification.
So if we take all these dialogues, the critical race theorists, the Marxists, the pedagogues, and we boil it down, what is the central thesis they all seem to converge on?
The core argument is synthesis and simultaneity. They assert that all the major forms of oppression, racial, social class, gender, linguistic, and sexual, are inseparable.
Not just connected, but inseparable.
Inseparable. And they work simultaneously as a single, integrated, and mutually reinforcing system. They are not just correlated, they are, in their words, co-constitutive.
Co-constitutive. So one helps create the other. And where is this integrated system rooted? What's the foundation?
Structurally, it's rooted in economic inequality, specifically capitalism, which, Orlis notes, is maintained by these powerful ideologies like white supremacy. So the key takeaway for you, the listener, is this. Fighting oppression, therefore, requires a unified, multi-layered struggle.
You can't just pick one.
You can't.
Yeah.
You have to engage at the material level, that's the economic inequality, at the epistemological level, which is the production of knowledge and truth, and at the political level, the control of institutions. And you have to do it all at the same time.
Because if you only fix one axis.
The matrix, powered by all the others, just remains intact.
All right, let's jump into those core insights, starting with this deep critique of colorblindness and what the book calls majoritarian myths that prop up the whole system. This is where critical race theory, or CRT, becomes central.
It does.
We hear that term thrown around everywhere today, but how do scholars like Richard Delgado and David Gilborn actually define it in this context? What is it for?
For them, CRT is essential because it moves the discussion past the idea that racism is just about, accidental slights or a few individual bad actors, or that it's just a product of ignorance.
The bad apples theory.
Exactly. That's psychological or individual racism. Systemic racism in the CRT framework is institutional. It is actively functioning as a mechanism by which society maintains specific social, political, and economic relations. As Gilborn puts it, it's not a bug in the system, it's a necessary feature that produces and reproduces inequality.
A feature, not a bug. And we tend to think of laws as the great equalizer, yet Delgado argues that the legal system itself can reinforce racism, even when it looks like it's granting victories to marginalized groups.
This is a really challenging but, I think, crucial insight. Delgado uses the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 ruling that declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional, as his prime example.
A case everyone sees as a huge step forward.
And it was, but he suggests that these breakthrough civil rights cases often arrive in response not purely to the interests of the oppressed, but to something he calls a majoritarian interest.
Okay, what does that mean, a majoritarian interest in the context of Brown?
Well, think about the time. The U.S. was locked in the Cold War, desperately trying to project an image of democratic freedom and racial equality onto the global stage to win over newly independent nations in Africa and Asia.
And legal segregation was a pretty bad look.
It was an enormous liability. It was a propaganda gift to the Soviet Union. So by striking down legal segregation, the U.S. government achieved a major foreign policy victory that served a majoritarian. That is, a white, establishment interest in global stability and ideological competition.
So the victory addressed the legal framework, the explicit rule,
Right.
but it often left the underlying structural foundation completely untouched.
Precisely. And this is compounded by policies that seem totally neutral. CRT historians show how instruments like the GI Bill, which provided subsidized mortgages and educational benefits after World War II, or even modern things like school choice, though they seem race-neutral on paper.
In practice, they operated very differently.
In practice, they often function to secure wealth, land, and influence almost exclusively for the white majority. This was often at the direct expense of non-whites who were systematically denied access to those same benefits through things like housing policies like redlining. These rules, customs, and privileges are how white supremacy maintains itself as an interconnected system.
And the result of these hidden structural advantages is that when someone today points out the persistent wealth gap or the lack of educational parity, they are immediately met with this post-racial fallacy.
Yes. And Delgado argues this fallacy is a frontal attack on any real dialogue about race.
A frontal attack.
The discourse basically says, we have a black president, we have highly successful black and Latino celebrities, therefore racism must be over. And this allows critics to immediately label anyone who points out persistent systemic inequality as just being a complainer or, playing the race card.
And Orlis adds that this ideology makes it a genuine cultural offense to even speak out about racial prejudice in public life.
It's seen as divisive or unproductive or just backwards thinking, and that is a very, very efficient feedback loop for maintaining the system just as it is.
That framing really drives home how powerful that critique of colorblindness is. But let's turn to that classic debate the book tackles, which is the stronger axis of oppression, race, or class. Now, the scholars argue for synthesis, but Richard Delgado makes a really strong evidence-based argument that for dark-skinned minorities, racism often remains a more significant and unavoidable barrier than classism.
Yeah, and this point is rooted entirely in lived reality and the physical marker of skin color. Delgado highlights this fundamental difference. You can, theoretically, change your class status. You can get more education, a better job, accumulate wealth.
Right, there's a path, however difficult.
But you cannot change your skin color. Therefore, class mobility, no matter how great it is, does not neutralize the physical, visible reality of being perceived by the system as other or as a threat.
And the book brings this home with some really powerful personal anecdotes. They call it the professional's predicament.
Indeed. Delgado, who is a Chicano law professor with all the status and income that comes with that, recounts being stopped by university police in his own law building late one evening for merely looking out of place.
In his own workplace.
In his own workplace. He was approached, questioned, and made to feel unwelcome simply because he was a person of color present during off hours. It wasn't about theft, as you said. It was about his mere presence.
The system flagged him as an anomaly.
Exactly. And he also recounts being pulled over by highway police while driving a rental car back from an academic conference. The police had absolutely no reason other than a desire to check him out based on his visual profile. And he notes with this immense frustration that these incidents had nothing to do with my income or class, but with my color and race.
The system targets the racial identity,
irrespective of the economic class status. The book also highlights the famous story of philosopher Cornel West being repeatedly racially profiled and stopped by police in Princeton, of all places, a high-status academic community.
Hearing that anecdote from a law professor, someone with such high social capital, it really drives home the inescapability of race. It makes you realize how fragile class mobility really is in the face of racial profiling.
It is.
You might acquire wealth, but you can't acquire immunity from the look of suspicion.
That's the crucial insight. Class privilege can offer some protection, for sure, but the systemic risk that's associated with race remains a constant taxing factor on your life.
Delgado also addresses another critical systemic failure, which is the danger of the traditional black-white binary paradigm in civil rights law.
Yes. For decades, the civil rights movement and all the legislation that followed primarily focused on the historical oppression of African Americans. That's the black-white paradigm. And while that was immensely necessary, this traditional approach often inhibits progress for other groups.
Like Latinos, Asian Americans, indigenous population.
Right. Groups who face discrimination based on unique factors that the black-white framework just doesn't easily capture.
Can you give us an example of how that failure plays out? How does it actually inhibit progress?
Well, Consider discrimination based on immigration status or foreign accents or just having a foreign-sounding surname. A traditional civil rights case focusing on employment discrimination might be built around historical structural racism against Black Americans. But a Latino worker who is facing discrimination because they speak with a heavy accent or because their name signals foreignness is dealing with all these different layers of categorization.
Linguistic, national origin, and racial, all at once.
All at once. And that's very difficult to redress under the existing narrower legal approaches. Delgado stresses that we are dealing with complex layers that the traditional legal framework simply fails to see, let alone address.
So the book moves past prioritizing one form of oppression and pushes toward a structural synthesis that says both must be analyzed together. You have scholars like Zeus Leonardo, Antonia Darder, and Eduardo Bonilla Silva who explicitly reject that orthodox Marxist view of prioritizing class struggle.
They do, but at the same time, they insist that any racial analysis must always look at the political economy.
So they're not throwing class out.
Not at all. They reject the idea of setting up a hierarchy of oppressions because they believe all these forms are just inextricably linked. This is the move toward a full race-class analysis. And Leonardo offers this powerful analogy. He says that just as space and time cannot be separated in physics, they are co-constitutive elements of the universe. Race and class must be understood together.
So the racial order is a class order.
And it has been for centuries.
Yeah. So the struggle for liberation against racism must simultaneously be a struggle against capitalist oppression. Is that the argument?
Absolutely. Bonilla Silva stresses that you cannot fight one effectively without addressing the other. And this synthesis directly challenges that traditional Marxist idea that race is simply a divide and rule tactic.
Right. The idea that it's just a tool used by capital to distract the white working class from their true economic interests.
Yes, and the scholars in this volume find that explanation to be, well, insufficient, and some even say racist.
Why? Why is it racist?
Because it's historically inaccurate and it's patronizing. David Gilborn, citing the work of Charles Mills, argues very forcefully that systematic racial exploitation and the transatlantic slave trade actually preceded industrial capitalism.
It came first.
It came first, and crucially, it provided the foundation for it. The wealth, the capital accumulation, the trade generated by racial slavery, that was the economic engine that fueled the Industrial Revolution in the West. Race wasn't some later convenient distraction, it was the original mechanism of capital extraction.
Wow. That completely shifts the narrative. The system wasn't invented, and then race was just slotted in to divide workers.
No.
Race was foundational to the system's initial creation and its growth.
Exactly. And to dismiss race as merely a tactic to distract workers is seen by these scholars as superficial. It marginalizes the experiences of billions of people of color whose systematic economic exploitation built the modern world. It elevates the theoretical concerns of predominantly white-class theorists, the focus on labor struggle, while minimizing the material reality of racial bondage and genocide.
And the book has hard data cited to show how race inequity often surpasses class differences in key social outcomes, especially in education.
It does. The source cites UK data that compares educational achievement gaps. And what they found was that the achievement gap between Black boys and white boys who do not receive free school meals, so they're ostensibly from the same middle to higher class background, that gap was 17.2 percentage points.
Yeah, 17 points.
Now, that difference is greater than the difference associated with class status alone. The gap between Black boys who do and do not receive free school meals was only 11.7 points.
So the race gap was bigger than the class gap, even within the same class.
Correct. And this suggests that for some minoritized children, the racism that saturates the education system is the biggest structural obstacle they face, regardless of their family's economic situation. The racial system is a more consistent and more potent barrier than economic status alone in that context.
Let's turn to language then, because it's often overlooked in a traditional race-class analysis, but the book treats it as a major system of power and social ordering.
It does. Richard Delgado argues that language use is a key mechanism for ordering social relations and for perpetuating stereotypes.
And how did that work in practice?
Well, language operates as symbolic capital. The power of a language is tied to prestige and who gets to wield it. Delgado notes the enforcement of English-only rules, you see them pushed in the workplace or in public services, and how they penalize people for speaking non-prestige languages like Spanish.
But the key insight is the selectivity of that enforcement, isn't it? It's not applied equally.
Absolutely not. These rules are rarely, if ever, enforced against people speaking high-prestige languages like French or German or Italian, particularly when they're spoken with an upper-class accent.
Right. No one's telling the investment banker to stop speaking French on his phone.
Exactly. So the issue isn't the foreign language itself, it's the association of the language with a specific marginalized or low-status group, which is almost always tied to race or immigrant status. The socioeconomic penalty is not for being bilingual, but for being identified as a low-status transnational subject through your speech.
And this connects directly to the identity struggle of what Zeus Leonardo calls transnational subjects of color. This is about assimilation into a rigid, racialized system.
It is. Immigrants and refugees of color who arrive in the U.S. often come completely unprepared for a fully racialized social system. In their home countries, their identity might be defined ethnically or tribally or nationally, not by this rigid, color-coded structure.
So they have to learn a whole new set of rules about who they are.
They have to learn to navigate what Leonardo calls an undeclared apartheid system. They're often forced to choose one of 4 or 5 main racial categories: Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, which initially makes absolutely no sense to them.
So they arrive and are immediately subjected to this intense, forced process of racialization.
They are forced to assimilate this new racial identity into their specific ethnic and cultural histories. Leonardo himself, who is of Filipino descent, recounts this process of learning to be a brown-yellow in the United States. He realized he wasn't considered an Asian American in the political sense until he stepped onto U.S. soil and was categorized by the dominant group,
The identity is imposed from the outside.
completely externally, and it dictates the terms of their socioeconomic engagement from that moment on.
It sounds like an immensely heavy and frustrating process. You spend your life figuring out what race means for you, only for the dominant group to then turn around and assert that it's a vacuous concept through this post-racial discourse.
That paradox is precisely why critical race theory is so necessary. It maps the material consequences of an identity that the powerful insist doesn't even exist anymore. And Sonia Nieto further emphasizes that identity isn't static, it's a constant struggle.
A struggle against what?
She says people should have the right to affirm multiple fluid identities, but that requires fighting every single day against the interlocking forces of white supremacy, patriarchy, and classism, which constantly try to flatten or deny that complexity.
Okay, let's zoom out even further and look at the macro forces of capitalism and neoliberalism. Peter McLaren argues these have completely transnationalized the production process.
He does. McLaren points out that we have moved from a world economy where you have different national economies trading with each other to a truly global economy.
What's the difference?
The difference is that now national systems are functionally integrated into these global circuits of capital and labor. He states it unequivocally. Neoliberal globalization is essentially the modern-day way of doing colonialism.
And the result of this transnational capitalism is what he terms a global apartheid.
Exactly. And this global apartheid is a racialized division and stratification of resources, of wealth, of power. It separates the core global economies, primarily North America, Europe, and Japan, from the billions of mostly Black, brown, and poor people across the global South. And the system is designed to facilitate the maximum extraction of wealth and labor from the periphery to the core.
And this global exploitation is often defended by political systems that claim to represent participatory democracy. Noam Chomsky, of course, offers a famously sharp critique of what that participatory democracy actually means in the U.S. context.
Chomsky argues that U.S. democracy only really functions optimally for the rich and for big corporations. He uses the 2008 financial crisis as a perfect real-world example of the mechanism. He says the professional economists who were so influential and whose ideas drove deregulation and massive risk, they were influential because their ideas served the short-term interests of powerful financial entities like Goldman Sachs.
So the incentives were all aligned. The economists got prestige and influence, and the powerful banks got to operate with fewer constraints, which meant more profit.
Precisely. And those experts who warned of disaster, who pointed to the structural flaws, they were ignored. They were sidelined. Why?
Yeah.
Because their critiques did not contribute to the interest of the powerful. Chomsky concludes that the function of the intellectual class is often to serve as a propaganda arm for those with economic power, regardless of the eventual catastrophic outcomes for everyone else.
And he essentially denounces the hypocrisy of the U.S. imposing its form of democracy abroad. The way it speaks about countries in Latin America, for instance, when its own system is so deeply compromised by these power interests.
He does. He suggests the U.S. should look inward, maybe learn from countries like Bolivia, which have had genuinely organized democratic elections that actually reflect the will of the population, unlike the U.S., where money so often dictates political access and outcomes.
And this same logic, as McLaren points out, extends seamlessly to our institutions, like education.
Hmm. Universities themselves now follow a corporate model, fitting the overall logic of the capitalist system. The system's goal is not genuine critical emancipation or, knowledge for its own sake.
So what is the goal?
The goal is to produce good patriots and capitalist workers, which often leads to what he terms an education in mystification.
An education in mystification, meaning it teaches you how the system works in theory, but it carefully hides the mechanisms of exploitation that make it run in practice.
That's a perfect summary.
We've established this interconnected matrix of oppressions and the macro-level economic forces that contain resistance. Now we need to really map the system itself. Who are the actors, what are the power structures, and how are these toxic systems maintained over time?
Okay, to understand the actors maintaining this racialized class system, we have to look historically. Steve Martinott's analysis, which Peter McLaren cites, is crucial here. He identifies a turning point after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, a moment where poor whites and black slaves temporarily allied against the wealthy elite.
An alliance that must have terrified the ruling class.
It absolutely did. And to prevent any future cross-racial class solidarity, the elite engineered a profound structural choice for poor whites.
What was the choice?
White workers were effectively made a control stratum. They were given specific privileges and, crucially, tasked with policing African slaves. This created a profound duality for working-class whites. They could pursue class struggle for economic equality alongside black slaves, or they could prioritize social cohesion based on their white identity and privilege.
And historically, we know which choice they largely made.
They chose the latter. This allegiance reinforced white supremacy because belonging to the corporate organization and the social body of whiteness took priority over social class unity. Their racist actions, like rejecting black workers and white-dominated unions, actually damaged their power as a social class in the long run.
But in the short term?
In the short term, it significantly enhanced their cultural power and political cohesion as white people. And this trade-off is one of the foundational mechanisms of U.S. structural inequality.
So the unequal structure was intentionally created and perpetuated by those who historically have had a monopoly of the wealth of the world, as Aurelius observes. And this places them in key positions to control institutions like the media, schools, the whole socioeconomic and political structure.
And this leads directly to a very modern deflection mechanism, the strategic use of what David Stovall refers to as puppets.
That's a very loaded term. How is it being defined in this analytical context?
Stovall notes that individuals of color who are appointed to key visible positions, he cites examples like a Supreme Court justice or an RNC chairman, people who reach very high status, they may be strategically used by the white power structure to fake racial diversity.
So they aren't appointed to fundamentally change the system?
No. They're not there to challenge the status quo. They're appointed to serve as a shield against accusations of racism.
So their presence is about optics and diverting critique, rather than implementing policy change that might threaten the dominant structure.
Exactly. They act as a puppet, an individual who, through their race, seems to confirm that the system is fair and accessible, but who lacks the institutional or political autonomy to truly challenge the system's underlying mechanisms of inequality. Their high-profile success just reinforces that majoritarian myth that anyone can make it, regardless of the structural barriers.
Let's specifically map the system of education, then. It's meant to be the great equalizer, but the book suggests it's deeply flawed by some very specific incentives.
It is. Aurelius highlights what he calls institutional persistence. So think about those who hold the key institutional positions. University presidents, deans, department heads. They are very often dominant white males who have directly benefited from the status quo that advanced their careers and created their wealth.
Which creates a very clear incentive problem.
It absolutely does. They have little internal interest and often no political pressure to radically transform the very system that promoted them in the first place. This creates a powerful feedback loop. If you benefit from the existing structure, you are incentivized, both financially and professionally, to maintain it. Change represents a direct threat to your accumulated capital and status.
And this lack of transformation is starkly visible in the devastating crisis facing Black and Latino males, which Pedro Noguera analyzes. This is where the intersection of race, class, and gender creates the devastating school-to-prison pipeline.
Noguera highlights that the massive rates of incarceration for these groups, those who aren't graduating, who are unemployed, are fundamentally linked to economic exploitation. This is where the concept of a new slavery emerges.
What does he mean by that?
He means that inmates are forced to sell their labor for pennies in prison industries. The system of mass incarceration feeds a need for cheap, controlled labor.
So the pipeline isn't just a social failure, it's an economic mechanism.
The racialized and gendered classification of criminal feeds an economic system that needs cheap labor. It effectively criminalizes a portion of the population based on race and class to ensure continued economic benefit for others. This is the material outcome of that interconnected matrix we talked about.
We also see these systems mapping in the contemporary shift in education toward marketization, like the big move toward charter schools.
David Stovall views the policy of closing public schools, which often serve the most marginalized, poor, and Black and Latino communities, and converting them to charter schools as the marketization of education. It's the commodifying of a public service.
And what's the systemic consequence of that commodification in education?
Well, the process ultimately solidifies a group of young people who are declared disposable by the state because they don't fit the new educational model. It reinforces the inequity gap because privatization inherently involves exclusion. Stovall critically asks, who has access to the quality schools? And are these new marketized schools actually bridging the equity gap, or are they just creating an illusion of choice?
So it's a way for the system to look like it's innovating while reinforcing the same outcomes.
He points out that in Chicago, for example, the performance of charter schools often fails to exceed traditional public schools, but the perception of choice allows the system to deflect responsibility for its failures.
Okay, we've established how the system is built and incentivized. Let's look at the underlying psychological and political mechanisms, the feedback loops that keep these structures running even when the outcomes are demonstrably catastrophic, like the school-to-prison pipeline.
Christine E. Sleeter focuses on white privilege here, but not as a moral failing. She frames it as an unacknowledged systemic benefit. The persistence of intolerance, the lack of enthusiasm for diversity, she argues, stems from white people being unwilling to give up the benefits and privileges that go along with whiteness. This institutionalized white supremacy, the assumption that white culture, norms, and systems are the default, is the root cause of systemic inequality.
And when resistance to that does emerge, the system has these sophisticated mechanisms to contain it. Antonia Darder explains this through her concept of containing revolutionary passion.
Yes, Darda argues that oppressive systems are maintained by successfully containing the natural revolutionary passion of the oppressed, the legitimate anger and the desire for justice that could otherwise fuel social upheaval. And this containment often happens insidiously, especially within educational settings, by teaching students to fear passion and by privileging a dispassionate style of communication.
And how does that style of communication function as a system of containment? It sounds so subtle.
It is subtle. A dispassionate, objective, academic style inherently favors those who are already comfortable and invested in preserving the status quo. It subtly delegitimizes arguments that are rooted in lived suffering or emotion or revolutionary fire. It effectively silences dissent from marginalized groups whose very experience of oppression is rooted in passion, pain, and urgency. It mandates that any critiques of the system must conform to the system's preferred language, which is a powerful form of control.
And finally, when the concrete evidence of inequality, the wage gaps, the educational disparities becomes undeniable, we see what Delgado calls structural deflection.
This is the rationalizing feedback loop. When critics of CRT or supporters of the post-racial myth are faced with clear evidence of unequal outcomes, they deflect. They use these seemingly objective concepts like statistical discrimination.
Give me an example of that.
They'll rationalize anti-Black or anti-Latino sentiments by asserting, for instance, that minorities commit more crimes or are younger, thereby explaining away unequal outcomes like wage gaps as just rational, market-based responses to perceived risks, rather than seeing it as systemic racism. This rhetorical deflection ensures the system doesn't have to face its own internal racialized contradictions. It reframes systemic failure as individual group failure.
Okay, looking at the world through this matrix lens, what are the current lived implications, especially when we bring gender and intersectionality back into the foreground?
Sonia Nieto offers a really crucial clarification on intersectionality here. While patriarchy is undeniably huge and pervasive for a specific individual, say a working-class black woman, the overriding issue she faces in her daily life might often be being black, or it might be being poor.
So it's not a flat hierarchy.
Not at all. She's dealing with multiple systems simultaneously, but the salience of the oppression, the one that is most actively harming her in a given moment, shifts depending on the specific institutional context she is navigating.
And Christine E. Sleater illustrates this complexity, particularly in high-status environments like academia, using the concept of the pyramid of power.
Yes. Women of color occupy these various intersecting axes of oppression within that pyramid, and it directly affects their career trajectories and their academic experiences. David Stovall mentions the specific difficulties faced by female graduate students of color. They often encounter intense isolation, they struggle to find prestigious fellowships, and they lack the kind of mentorship that their white or male counterparts might easily access.
So these barriers aren't just sexism.
There's sexism compounded by racism and classism, which is often tied to the university's institutional culture itself.
That ties directly into the shared, difficult experience of faculty of color in academia that's described throughout the book. Antonia Darder describes her experience as a Chicana academic as isolating and even a nightmare.
She describes feeling like a traitor who could not be trusted to protect the privilege of the institution. Why? Because her research and her very presence challenged the comfortable status quo, and she highlights that this isolation is often tied to deep-seated class insecurities.
Oh, okay.
Working-class people of color, even after they achieve professional success, often struggle with these subtle institutional messages of deficit and self-doubt, regardless of how many books they publish or how well they teach. They internalize the feeling of not belonging.
That's fascinating. The emotional and psychological impact of institutional racism is so often tied up in class insecurity and self-doubt. It's like a systemic form of psychological warfare against belonging.
It is. And that leads to the critical question of how to survive these toxic environments. Zeus Leonardo encourages a necessary response to this systemic demoralization. He says students and professors must be defiant to institutional racism. He notes that many scholars of color are initially derailed from their original interests, but eventually feel compelled to return to studying race, seeking a critical perspective on its limitations and its necessities.
And David Stovall provides more practical guidance on how to survive what he calls a toxic, racist university system while maintaining one's commitment to justice.
His emphasis is on finding community outside the university context. This external solidarity with activists, with local leaders, with community organizations is essential to reaffirm one's sanity and maintain a sense of power against an institution that is constantly trying to undermine your critical analysis.
It's about staying grounded in the struggle.
He stresses that active engagement and solidarity with the wretched of the earth, to borrow Frantz Fanon's term, are essential for academics to maintain their ethical commitment to social justice.
You know, this book, through its comprehensive analysis, really serves as a masterwork in systems thinking. It aligns perfectly with the core mission of Crisis in Perception by fundamentally shifting the focus away from individual morality and blame.
Absolutely. The book's core systems-level analysis moves the conversation away from judging individual bad acts to identifying the structural determinants of race, gender, and class oppression. And as McLaren details, these determinants are fundamentally rooted in capitalist production relations. The problem is not an accidental grouping of bigots. The problem is the unequal, race-based political and economic system itself, a system which requires profound transformation.
And one of the most powerful insights the book provides is showing how power is so often hidden inside processes that appear neutral or objective.
That is a consistent thread throughout the entire matrix. The ideology of colorblindness is framed as equality, but functionally, it's a political tool that makes it a cultural offense to critique racial inequality, thereby silencing opposition.
Right. And the marketization of education is framed as efficiency and choice.
But it's a process of commodification that exacerbates existing inequity by declaring certain children disposable. Language rules appear objective and meritocratic, but they are selectively enforced to target non-prestige groups. Power operates most efficiently through these invisible, objective-sounding mechanisms that just deflect criticism.
And finally, The scholars are aiming to dismantle these harmful moral narratives that are so deeply embedded in our institutions and in our public life.
They are directly challenging the persistent denial of structural racism and the promotion of narratives that blame the poor or the marginalized for their lack of opportunity. And they also challenge the narrative that uncritically upholds capitalism as being synonymous with democracy or freedom.
So what do they advocate for instead?
The book advocates for what they call revolutionary critical pedagogy and an epistemological revolution, which means a revolution in how we produce and validate knowledge.
An epistemological revolution.
Yeah.
That sounds like challenging the very foundation of what we accept as truth.
It is. It's about challenging the coloniality of power and the Eurocentric genealogy of thought. The assumption that Western, white, male thought must exclusively dictate how we pursue social progress or how we conceptualize a non-capitalist future. They argue that liberation must be defined by the lived experiences and the intellectual frameworks of those on the margins.
This deep dive, informed by Pierre Aurelius's dialogues with these leading critical scholars, has been truly essential. I think what the book really helps us see differently is that oppression is never a single-axis problem. It's a dynamic, interwoven, and mutually reinforcing structure.
It forces us to acknowledge that race, class, and gender inequalities are simultaneous, that socioeconomic marginalization cannot be reduced to individual shortcomings, laziness or bad choices or lack of ambition. It relies on interconnected global, historical, and institutional systems shaped by colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism.
And why is truly grasping this systemic, intersectional perspective so vital for anyone trying to understand the world today?
Because it highlights that relying solely on good intentions or symbolic victories, like electing a person of color to a high office, or even individual rhetorical changes, will never lead to genuine democracy and equity. True change requires collective effort and struggle aimed at dismantling foundational structural configurations. If you want equity, you have to fight at the material, the political, and the knowledge production levels all at the same time.
That unified approach is the major takeaway. The book doesn't offer a simple recipe for revolution, does it? But it does leave us, the listeners, with a necessary and provocative challenge.
It does. It asks, now that you have this knowledge, this understanding of how racial, class, gender, and linguistic oppressions are wired into the system, what is your responsibility? The book deliberately ends by asking you, will you remain a knowledge keeper, just absorbing this information and staying silent, which, in effect, is silently agreeing with the status quo? Or will you use your knowledge and your privileges, whatever they may be, to take a stance against oppression and align yourself with those who have been marginalized? That knowledge, they argue, demands a position.
Our deep dive today was based on the essential collection Rethinking Race, Class, Language, and Gender, edited by Pierre W. Aurelius, featuring dialogues with Noam Chomsky, Richard Delgado, Antonia Darter, and many other leading scholars.
If the ideas we discussed today resonated with you, we encourage you to read the book yourself and engage with these critical perspectives. Please consider supporting the author and the contributing scholars if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.